Strip and the conditions in Gaza in the second half of the programme. Now, earlier I trailed the new book by BBC economics expert Paul Mason, a man whose every word is hung on, I'm sure, by the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling. Sorry, I have to stop myself here and come out with a rhetorical. Surely no one has ever travelled further across the political spectrum than Alistair Darling, a former Trotskyist who I first met pressing pamphlets about Marxist dialectics into the hands of bemused striking railway workers at Waverley Station in Edinburgh, to his position now, perusing menus in the finest restaurants and embracing captains of industry and all their works. I'll be talking to Paul Mason about his book and about how we got into the recession Darling can't admit we're in, and how we can extricate ourselves from it after this.
Ow! Just the way you move, it's a real deal. And the way you groove, oh, it's the way I feel, yeah. You're a wild thing and you're a natural star. Got me crazy about the way you walk. So baby, you're the real deal.
It's The Real Deal with me, George Galloway, here on Press TV. Now, Paul Mason, welcome. I showcased your book when it first came out. This is a new edition, an updated edition. Live Working, Die Fighting. Sounds like an exciting title. Tell us what the book's about.
The slogan that the book's title is based on was a slogan of the French silk workers in the 1830s. Their strike, and they went on strike and they seized the city of Lyon in southern France in 1831 and in 1834, rocked the world, not just because it was a strike, there'd been strikes, but as the famous journalist who stumbled upon this situation put it, the barbarians at the great gates of Europe are not out on the plains of Tartary, they are in the suburbs of our capital cities. It was the first time that the rulers of Europe understood that something had grown up within European society that would challenge them fundamentally and challenge the way that society was run fundamentally. They had always perceived the threat to it from without. I think there's an interesting parallel now, because I think the big hidden story of the last 20 or 30 years has been the emergence of a global working class, a global factory workforce, 3 billion strong, double the size it was during the Cold War, that we don't seem to have noticed. We've been obsessed with, rightly obsessed with, the security situations in the world, the wars, the famines, the floods. But at the end of this period, I think we will look back and say, hey, the most amazing social transformation, the biggest journey by the most people in the world happened, and we hardly really told that story. So that's what my book tries to do. It tells some episodes of that story and draws some historical parallels with the great days of working class and labour movement struggle that I've tried to study and bring to life in this book.
And brilliantly, the first edition was a masterpiece. Now, if we didn't notice this global proletariat being formed, there was a period in Britain, perhaps this very period you refer to, the last 30 years, in which the myth, lie actually I would call it, that there was no longer any class in Britain, was propagated by our betters, our rulers. But you may have heard in my introduction, if you live in Lenzie, 9 miles away from the Carlton in Glasgow, you live for 28 years longer. How's that for a postcode lottery? You win the prize if you live in Lenzie, 9 miles away. And class is at the heart of that, surely.
It is. It's absolutely at the heart of it. I was trying to film, in my role as a BBC journalist, a story about public health, what's been wrong with the public health system. There's many suggestions about how to put public health right in this country. And we were travelling along in a mining area in the north of England, and I said to my colleagues, what we should do now is stop and go into this cemetery. Because if we go into this cemetery, I can tell you what we're going to see. And they went, what? And I said, we'll see lots of headstones where men have died below the age of 60, because it's a mining area. And we went in, and I'd say 2/3, 3/4 of all the recent burials of men were below the age of 60. It's to do not just with class, because class brings to people's minds stuff like poverty and starvation, and in many countries that's what it does mean. I think if you look at the history of the working class. It also means something else. There's a mental impoverishment that is involved in having to work 10, 12, 14 hours a day. There is a physical degradation. There's stuff about diet.
And never getting anywhere, isn't this the point? The dispiriting point. That you're working actually only to sustain yourself, to go back to work the next day.
Well, I have nearly all my life been a white-collar worker. I am a journalist. But at the times I've worked in factories, when I was a kid, coming out of school, what struck me about it was not the hardness of the work, but the difficulty of getting your hands and head around the task, and how much you lose if you can't quickly do it. You know, that's what people who've never done manual work don't realise, that it's not just backbreaking, it can be backbreaking. It is the experience of the vast majority of the world's population is of going into a factory and having to do really hard things, really mentally difficult, challenging things every day to, you know, a deadline. It's harder than journalism, I can tell you.
Well, most journalists think that Swarfiga is a Canary Island, so that's another. Most politicians nowadays too. If it was abolished officially in Britain, I've never known of its existence in my lifetime in the United States. Yet Barack Obama, in his great speech in Denver, Colorado, made repeated references, first time I've ever heard it, to the American working class. Indeed, he even referred to picket lines.
Picket lines. He situated the American working class in the narrative of struggle. He gave a list. The migrants who came, the workers who went on the picket lines, and the women who struggled for the vote. This is very unusual, I think, as you point out, because it makes him the only contender, the only serious contender for political leadership in a major G7 country since the 1989 collapse of the Berlin Wall, who has used the language of class. Now, I think it's interesting. We know contingently why he has to do it, because there is that huge hinterland of white working class people in the southern and midwestern states of America who are seen as natural Republicans. I mean, if you look at it from outside, the Republican Party can be caricatured as a sort of right-wing, sort of upper-class party. Its base is the down-home, Midwest, plebeian people of America. It has an incredible resonance there. He has to overcome that, but he has something even bigger to overcome, because a whole swathe of the Democratic Party, like all American parties, is a coalition, and a whole swathe of that coalition are white manual workers who, the polls tell us, have distrusted him. They trusted Hillary Clinton more. So it's for a really interesting set of reasons. Obama is using language that no British Labour politician of his stature would ever use. I find this really interesting, and I think it confirms what I've said. I think the class has this cachet, especially in Europe, of what it had during the Cold War, which that it necessarily meant left. And it necessarily meant even communist, or a challenge to capitalism. Those, in my childhood, in this very, very sort of small c conservative mining community, anybody who talked about capitalism or class was seen as left-wing, so he didn't talk about it. They didn't want to be that. But now, I think, 20 years on, 30 years on from the fall of the Berlin Wall, the idea and the phenomenon is beginning to be recognised and talked about more openly. That, to me, is simply a reflection of what is going on in the world. The working class that I write about in the book is a new working class. I have, you know, sat in trade union halls in India where there is a statue of Lenin on the wall, but they haven't been very effective trade union halls, and the most effective ones have been ones where often they are coexisting with huge flocks of cattle. It's kind of, i.e., these are people who've thrown together their means of organisation very, very quickly amid all their traditional cultures, and the trade union culture jostles quite amicably with all the other cultures of, for example, the Hindu street in New Delhi, where I'm thinking of. That's a new phenomenon. And therefore, I think people are actually becoming more comfortable in discussing and using the word class now than they were. at the highlight, the height of your political career, maybe, when it had that meaning.
Well, perhaps the one group of people who knew that class had never gone away were the owners, the people like the Duke of Sutherland, who got their hands on the world's